sessions today is overturning a stone to find out whether or not this is embodying convergence. So I'd like to swiftly invite up our next panel moderator, Mr. Chris Story, co-host of Conversations in Close Protection, founder of Birch and Stone, and many other hats. And then I'd like to bring up our panelists. I'd love to bring up Dr. Stephen Huber, Scott Walker, and of course Scott Farrer for our panel. And then I'm going to leave you in Chris's capable hands.
Okay, well, first off, thank you, Fallon, for hosting this, and then thank you to my esteemed guests and panelists here, two of which are named Scott, so we'll go with Scott, doctor, and...
Not doctor.
And, okay, all right, fair enough. Okay,
Just
good.
don't call me late for dinner.
Just don't call them late for dinner. Okay, great. I think this is a great opportunity to have a discussion or a continued discussion about what's been talked about thus far already, which is the convergence piece and what is a GSOC and where should it all reside and what do we do and all the things, right? And so the question is, it says here, is threat intelligence a cornerstone of corporate security modernization and convergence, or really any security modernization and convergence, right? And I would say, well, my thought process is like that. The answer to that is no, right? Because threat is only one aspect that we really focus on. So I'd like to change that question to say, is risk intelligence the cornerstone of corporate or any security function, if that makes sense, right? And then based on what we've talked about before, I just want to set this piece out so we can start our discussion, is that for the most part, the GSOC kind of tends to be CCTV, access control, maybe a news feed, and then like Christian just talked about, like the $15 an hour guard managing all of that, right? So that's usually the model, and with the exception of Carlos, who is at the leading edge, right? Flexing on everybody with his $200 million, all the things, right? So,
Looks like
so freaking, is this being recorded, Fallon? Can I use that word? Never mind.
Too late.
So anyways, so I think we can all agree that that's leading edge, right? But the rest of us all work in a different space where we're trying to make decisions on whether convergence is a good idea for us, what that looks like, and where risk or threat intelligence should reside, and what does that look like to and for us. So can we all kind of agree on that before we move forward? Is that dude is the outlier, the rest of us are in the normal space? Okay, all right. So having said that, like, is it risk intelligence? Is it the GSOC, or is it threat? What should that look like?
Oh, we're starting with me.
Yes, sir.
Start with you.
Yes, sir. Don't go late for dinner.
Pick that seat.
Yes.
At the hot seat.
Yes.
Risk for sure. Yeah, everything starts based off of risk.
Okay, and so why is that, right?
You're developing your plan or your approach based on the different variables that expose you to risk.
Okay. So as we talked about fusion centers before, we're asking, like, well, who do we put in the room? Right? What does that look like? And I think one of the big pieces that we talked about before is that, well, first off, we have to know our business to know what can affect our business. And I think if we rely on that person who's that $15 an hour person or whatever the case is, and then we put them next to a cyber person who's probably $130 an hour and they know all the things, that's going to be kind of a weird conversation, right? It's not going to be one way. Don't talk to me, and I know all the things, right? So I think that's kind of what makes sense. And then as we look at risk, what risks as we see, whether it's a private family office or corporate environment, and when we say private family office, we're talking about entities or family offices that are worth more than sometimes publicly traded companies, right? So as we understand what that is. Risk is one thing. There are many things that provide risk to the organization, but what do we look at as far as from a threat perspective? Doctor?
You want me to jump in?
Yes, sir.
So I think you have to look at my background, my approach translates from my days. I spent 30 years in the FBI, and the last...
We have to drink.
So in the last years, last years of my career running the Joint Terrorism Task Force, working in a fusion center and using intelligence to assess threats, right? Does that translate into GSOC world? That's what it comes down to. Mm-hmm. And I would argue it does conceptually. the toughest thing is the definitions. So what's a threat? You throw that word threat out there and people are like, a threat, that word alone can be kind of ambiguous. But if you look at levels of threats, if you are addressing risk or assessing risk when the threat is at its lowest level, providing you're paying attention to the threat at its lowest level, then you probably can mitigate it before it gets to its highest level. Unfortunately, most of the time, our preparedness is DEFCON 5, right? Our preparedness programs, whether it's in business, whether it was back in the day in the federal government, national security, it was, are we prepared for the worst? Rather than taking a look at threat intelligence at its lowest level and maybe mitigating at a lower level. The tough thing is spending money on something that you don't know is going to happen because you can't prove a negative. So if you mitigate it at its lowest level, are you going to go into the boss and say, we just saved you $1 billion? Because had we not done that, it would have gone to number 5 and you would have lost $1 billion. Well, there's no way of proving that. But how do you balance threat intelligence, mitigating threats at its lowest level before it gets to the highest level, with being prepared for DEFCON 5? That's the convergence paradox I think we deal with.
Okay. So, Scott, what about do you have a way to measure?
The reality is measuring will come with automation, because if we don't converge, we die. If you didn't know that, you do now. If we don't adapt, we die. Convergence is, hey, we've got all these linear vertical areas, everybody's walled off, everybody has their castle that they're creating. The reality is, if we don't come together and we start building these kind of the people that will mitigate these risks or mitigate these threats, we're going to die. And so we have to adapt to and adopt automation. We have to be comfortable with artificial intelligence, regardless of what Elon Musk says. Yeah, it'll probably kill us all, right? Got it. Skynet is going to take over. But those are the tools that we'll need, because if we aren't measuring it, it has no value. Right? And you can't measure it just off of like, today I want to measure it. Like, okay, yeah, I do too. Or today I want the data.
Give me metrics.
Yeah, you got to measure it over time, right?
Yeah.
So if we aren't engaging it and we aren't measuring it right now, you're really losing out in the future, because you won't be able to make that argument that, hey, this is we just mitigated $1 billion in loss. Okay,
Right.
says who?
Yeah.
Right?
Well, then risk threshold kind of comes into play too, right? Because my risk threshold might be way different than yours, so quantifying that risk becomes a little bit different, right? But I think there is a way. I don't have the actual equation, but there is a way for us to at least quantify in some way, shape, or form over time what that would be, right? So at this point it was X, so we just quantify that X, right? If we let it go based on whoever's decision that is, then it becomes X times, whatever that piece is, right? So that becomes helpful. All right, so we get the right people in the room. They understand what is happening. We understand different thresholds. We're able to measure, right, risks or threats. What does that look like? And I think this is the great thing about this panel is that most of us, the good doctor withstanding maybe, are physical security people as opposed to cyber. Is that accurate?
I dabble.
On the ish? Dabble? Okay, fair enough. We all dabble, I think, without making it weird. But this is the great thing about it, is because now we're really trying to be forward-leaning into the convergence space rather than the opposite way. And I think I take this kind of personally because 10 or 12 years ago, I wrote a paper on why we shouldn't converge, right? I was one of those physical security guys that said, no, why, right? And now I've grown up. Really, well, or really, accurately, the threatscape has changed to where you have no choice but to, right? And if you don't, like Scott said, we're going to die on the vine.
Evolve.
Right? We have to, evolve or die, evolve or die. Okay, so yes, sir.
So I'll put on my other hat. So that was my first career. So my second one, and why I'm here, is now teaching up at Embry-Riddle University in Prescott the College of Security and Intelligence, College of Business Security and Intelligence. Now,
World
we've
renowned.
added business in there. So to your point, if we evolve, like you have, finally,
Don't let the brow or the knuckles, can fool you. Yeah, okay.
so if we evolve, how do we now integrate that into our educational system? Right? Because we're all here now.
Yeah.
There's another generation.
That's right.
Go take a look at our college up there. We got cybersecurity, we got corporate security, we've got national security, we got students. They want to do what you're doing. They want to do what I did. They whatever route they pick, they're going into this world. So that's a next generation coming up. Should we be teaching convergence into the next generation? So they come up with the concept already. We're not talking about it after they get out and they go, oh, wait a minute. We didn't know we were going to have to do all of this.
Right. And I know that that was probably a rhetorical question, but I think the answer was given in the couple panels previous, that Carlos was on, was security is security, right? Threats, we've got internal threats, external threats. What do those look like? And they might be digital, they might be cyber, they might be human. But as we categorize those, and I think they laid it out pretty well, which was physical, intellectual property, and financial risk, then it makes it pretty easy for a convergence piece to work together. Because what we see now in the GSOC is somebody just, in the silos that we work within now, not the missile silo that gentleman worked in, but the thought process is that, well, if there's a physical risk, then I just push it up the chain to whoever, and it just gets handled somewhere, right? Or I might go to HR, right? But if somebody's a cyber risk that has access to a system, where does that go, and
Right.
how does physical security solve that problem?
So that brings you back to the convergence. You know, you got all the right people in the right room. Hopefully the IT guy is not going to consider the physical security guy a knuckle tracker.
Right.
But he's enough of a specialist, and there will always be specialists. But the people of the future that the good doctor is training need to have a lot of tools in their tool bag to be able to address things on many different levels, or at least know to be able to recognize something to go to the right people to address that threat. And I just want to rewind a little bit. I've always been fond of, and I can usually overuse the analogy of risk and reward, is how I tend to kind of distill things down quite often. You don't know how to react to it without having the dialogue to explain to the people involved, your stakeholders, okay, what could be the consequences of not addressing this on this level, even though it is still at a very low level if you caught it quickly, potentially what it could be, why you want to react to it the way that you're suggesting based on risk and reward potential.
Mm-hmm. And again, that goes back to that. What is our organization's risk tolerance? So when you go to that executive with that thought process, you're not, saying the world's on fire over what is
Right.
considered a low risk. And I think at times, $5 million to some of us, that's a lot of risk, right? But to the organization from enterprise risk management, they're like, that's not even on our radar. Like, yep, we'll move on. We'll do other things with our resources. So just understanding how that impacts the business helps us go with better use cases to solve those problems, I think.
Well, and the risk of today is not my risk of tomorrow. I mean, things change at the speed of light, right? Another speaker earlier today was talking the cyber sense, how you can pivot, right? We need to be that flexible if we can on the physical side as well.
Right. And I would say, Christian talked about the same thing. It's like, how do we change based on the threatscape and being ahead of it? Oh, by the way, who here from the cyberspace is ahead of all the risks and threats that you face?
Liar.
Anyone? Right.
Liar.
So clearly, we're all reactive and for the most part, or we like to say responsive, I'm sure. And we're all kind of at the behest of the executive decision maker, right? Because we tell them that, well, we're just here to help you make decisions.
Which brings you back to metrics, because the C-suite's really only going to take you seriously if you can speak with data.
That's right.
Right. Okay. All right. No? Go ahead.
I got a point on that, though. So how do you not fall into the McNamara fallacy? Since you mentioned data and
You're
metrics.
way over my head, Mr.
Pat
IT
Messel.
guy.
So in Vietnam, we killed about 850,000 60,000 of their guys.
Oh, right.
And we only lost about 60,000 of our guys, so we won the war, right? Except we didn't. Just because you measure
Right.
it doesn't mean you.
Well,
can
what is it?
understand.
Help me
Measure
out
is
here.
understanding.
You may know there's lies, damn lies in statistics. And
Yeah.
and it's all the way
What is
that
it,
you shape the numbers.
85% of statistics are wrong,
Yeah.
73% of the time.
It's
or
all
whatever.
dependent on the audience and what you're trying to achieve.
Well, and I think what was stated earlier, very much earlier in the day, was how do I translate risk into business terms?
Yeah.
Right, into business risk, okay? Hey, we might get shot up and have an active shooter and all these, because of physical security thing, active shooter with that. This, a lot of people could get hurt. Okay, great. That sounds horrible. What is that going to cost us, right? And then so then you attach a dollar amount to it from an impact perspective, and another dollar amount to it to a reputational perspective. What does that look like? And then suddenly now people are going, oh, actually that might make sense for us to pay a little attention to. And I think it's not necessarily the McNamara effect, but it's it's just what numbers affect the story I'm trying to tell that are accurate, right? Not,
But again,
you
you
know.
get into Goodhart's law where the metric starts to drive the system, and that puts you in
Right.
that direction. So there's a whole bunch of metrics fallacies.
I think it's balance,
Okay.
right?
But I think also there's a communication issue, so if there's two pieces to it. Ownership, who's owning the problem
Okay.
and who's identifying the problem? Well, the CEO is going to identify the problem because the CEO is the one that's laying awake at night thinking of something that bothers him. It might not be a hack. It might not be a physical attack. Something is keeping him up at night or her. So, yeah, exactly. So if you own the problem, the potential problem, and there's communication with the CEO, with the C-suite saying, what's your number one threat? The word we don't want to use, but what's your number one risk? I'm in the threat world. What's your number one threat? What are you most concerned about? And then you own that threat and focus on that. Then the CEO knows somebody owns his number one threat. And so now you've got his or her attention. So it really doesn't come down to the metrics until you do the work. And then there's going to be a trust that when you walk in and say, if we do this, we will eliminate or mitigate or reduce or share or whatever that risk. And which way do you want to go? And then they make the decision. So ownership and identifying the priority threats. We were in the world of prioritization. What's the number one threat today? Because it could change tomorrow, right?
It will.
It will change tomorrow.
Right, and essentially,
Boss, what's the number one threat today?
and the chief risk officer is the CEO, right? Usually,
I know.
right?
Doesn't
Yeah,
make
so,
sense.
so I think
Makes
it's
sense.
also important to note, especially for our cyber folks, it's been proven, right, that senior executives are very, very good at identifying business and financial risk, correct? But because they're good at that, are they good at identifying cyber or physical risks? No, not at all. Who's the biggest violator of spearfishing and phishing? Executives, right? I know what's going on, click, right? And we go, well, you're the chief risk officer, so you tell me. So I think that's why it's important for us to translate those threats and vulnerabilities into risk, and then we're able to say, here's what the risk of doing that is, like you said, and here's what the risk of not doing that now is. And then if that changes tomorrow, then we're able to bring that to the forefront and say, okay, yeah, remember that was yesterday, today's today, and here's how here's how that's different, you know? So now if we talk about risk intelligence, combining cyber, combining physical, environmental, and most of us will stay away from financial. Anybody here work on financial risk at all? You do?
No.
Yeah, most of us are like, yeah, that's not us, buddy, right? So, we'll deal with somebody else. Now we can kind of see whether it's physical, cyber, intellectual property, or financial, who should be in the room and what threats that we should face, what risk we're all going to be looking at as we understand what the risk of the business is. I think Christian did a good point at saying, like, hey, look, if you work for a celebrity that sells music, what do they need to do? What are the risks? The risk is they've got a lot of people that want to touch them, want to see them, but the risk to their business is if they're hiding behind, a video camera, they don't make money. So we've got to be able to deal with that and figure out how to solve that problem. Different for like a chemical organization, or meat packing plants or whatever. Everybody's got different risks, so we have to face those accordingly and look at those threats. So getting those right people in the room. So it sounds to me like we're getting closer to answering the question is risk intelligence the cornerstone of convergence at some point?
I think so. Well, look, we also have to understand, as you said earlier, business, what's the business of the future look like? It's decentralized, it's flat, right? Everything you see in a technology company is what you will see in a traditional manufacturing company or a services company. So our future employees, which we don't have enough of, by the way, and we won't have enough of. If you didn't know, the baby boomer generation is retiring en masse throughout this year, right? And they are not coming back to the workforce. So if we aren't thinking about how do we keep flat to down, how do we keep decentralized, we need to be thinking about those things and all those things. If we're building the GSOC of the future, don't build it on yesterday's business. Start thinking about how do we build it, how do we embrace remote and mobile, right? I mean, cyber deals with this a little bit too, but we also need to embrace it on the physical side, right? It was a big shock for all of us, or some of us that have never had remote employees come March of 2020. Like, oh my gosh, what do we do? Put security badge readers in everybody's house? Do we have to put fire extinguishers in everybody's house? Do I have to train them how to, evacuate their home, right? That's not hyperbole, by the way.
No, I know.
Those are real things that people had to talk about. We had to redesign or the safety, health and safety, the way we engaged our employees. So if we're building this cutting edge or bleeding edge collaborative environment, just realize, and I don't mean to talk about Web 3.0 and metaverse, but just realize that by 2030, this is Financial Times of London did a survey on this of CEOs. By 2030, we'll have the most amount of people, 1 billion people will be working remote. Think about that, 1 billion people working remote. If we create something that, hey, we're creating this great business environment, you can come to Menlo Park, California and be in this cool office. Yeah, nice. 10 years, it's gonna be obsolete, maybe. I mean, I hope not. I hope we'll have enough workers to do it. But we need to be aware of that and be creating something that can be flexible and diverse and can kind of change and mold how we need it to.
Well, so let's talk about that a little bit, because I think we all experience that risk proposition of what are we responsible for, right?
Yeah.
Just like you talked about, some organizations have said, yep, we're telling you have to work at home, so therefore we assume the risk of wherever you are. And I've actually heard people on meetings say, well, I work in a crappy neighborhood, so can you move me? Because you're telling me.
Or my neighbor is
right,
threatening me, can you
right.
put security on me?
Right.
Not joking, those are the calls we got.
Right.
Yeah.
Or, hey, this is something that's a voluntary piece, and we monitor what's going on around you, and if there's a power outage or fire or whatever the case is, you've got this extremely distributed risk intelligence that's, everything's pinging up. Hey, Steve has a
And now
fire.
it's all over the world.
Exactly, globally, right? So I think those things can be, I think that can be attacked remotely.
Yeah.
I think managing it becomes somewhat of a bigger challenge because of what we talked about before, which is who's talking to who in the room, right? Is it, one of the things, so we built a security center a long time ago, and we just took our security officers and put them in casual clothing, and we had better officers, and that it bridged the gap between, you're not looking at some uniform guy. We tried to put the cyber guys in uniform, it didn't work. But there was a lot of pushback, and Birkenstocks don't go in, okay, so.
The Star Trek uniforms wouldn't fly.
I'd sign up for that.
Right. But I think, again, if we tackle the remote problem from a physical security perspective, leaning into the cyber and the convergence, what are your thoughts on challenges to that?
Distributed, you can't you know, like from a cyber perspective, you can't speak to the way that they have their home network set up, or what their Wi-Fi passwords are, or, you know.
Or who's standing behind them while they're
Anything of
working.
that nature, so, it's a whole new world.
Right, and those almost, well, 3 out of the 4 things that you said, or 2 out of the 3, are physical security challenges, right, that we would deal with in the physical workspace, right? Like, it wasn't a cyber issue if somebody could piggyback. That was piggyback. So in other words, I'm looking over your shoulder, looking at the screen watching, or whatever the new term is now. That was a physical security issue. You had to put screening on the outside of the, you know. Now it's access. Who's in your who's in your home office, observing or listening to what your work, overlooking those things, and then of course the network piece becomes a cyber piece. And I think probably remote work is likely going to be, that risk is going to be on the onus of, that's going to be that transfer, kind of like Kristen was talking about, like, look, you kind of need to know about your own network and meet the standards of the organization to be able to work there. So what are the positives of the distributed workforce, if any, from a security and a risk intelligence standpoint?
It'd be hard to put a long list together of positives, because you lose control, right? So I go right to the negative. It's tough to control. So the positives are only on the people that get to work from home, right? They don't have to drive, they don't have to.
Not to interrupt, but, okay, risk and reward here again, okay? The risk is it's distributed now, you can't speak to what's going on in people's homes, but you save a ton of money in leases and property costs. A ton of money.
Right, so there you go, there's the positive.
Well, I mean,
Financial benefit.
And I think we save so much money that from a business perspective, the
It's a risk
decision is
you'll
made.
accept.
Right.
Yep,
But
we're
from
going
a
to take that
security,
risk.
Oh,
I
absolutely.
went with the
Sure,
security
sure,
perspective,
yeah,
and
yeah.
it's hard. Any kind of loss of control
Yeah,
can't help but make it more difficult for security. Yeah, it's a financial benefit for all, right? Gas, commute, they're happier, right?
less stress.
But security-wise, yeah, I don't know that there's any upside.
Is anyone else a fan?
Insider threat, I guess.
Is anyone else a fan of the C
Physical
word?
insider threat.
Yeah. Yeah, the old control. Everybody wants control.
Yeah.
Okay. So have we gotten any closer to answering the question if risk intelligence is the cornerstone of corporate?
Absolutely.
I'll jump on it, and because I come from that world, and stuff I train and teach on now and speak about all starts with knowing more about the
Yeah.
threat. So any intelligence is
Yeah.
good intelligence.
Yeah.
The problem in business, though, I still see is, and I go back to the same word, ownership. Someone has to, and it can't be one person in a GSOC, you want multiple people looking at the same intelligence, because intelligence is interpreted. It's not fact, it's not evidence, and that's one thing I always teach in class, is intelligence is not evidence. Intelligence says something. It's up to you to interpret it. If it's interpreted wrong, I wrote a paper on, is intelligence ever wrong? Is it?
Interpreted, the way it's interpreted.
No,
It's
it's not
intelligence,
necessarily
not evidence.
ever wrong. How it's interpreted may be wrong.
How it's used.
But intelligence itself, that's all it is words.
You can dumb it down, though. I mean, you can give somebody a formula or standards that if you're presented with this list of intelligence,
Right.
these are the ways that you respond.
Yeah, multiple ways
Yeah.
interpreting the intelligence.
Formulaic.
And then, you can go to the proverbial, the overused term of connecting the dots. If
Yeah.
you've got 5 dots, everyone's gonna see it
Here's
as a
what you
different
do.
picture.
Yeah.
You make it 25, 30, 50, 100 dots, now everyone's starting to see the same picture, right? So, multiple people interpreting the same intelligence and then coming to a common approach. There's really no wrong approach, it just was interpreted wrong if it doesn't mitigate the threat.
Okay.
Yeah, and by
So
the
there you
way,
go.
to
So
kind of
it's
piggyback
important.
on this, data, points of data, the more you have, the better you understand the problem. And so to that point about, we talked about edge computing, and I don't know that, maybe even I don't even understand it as much as everybody else in the room, but when we are computing at the edge, we have a lot more data than we did before, right? if you can make things at the edge smarter, and they're doing their own computations and they're providing you the best answer or their best understanding of the answer, you can make better decisions. And I think this is the pipe dream, but we all, on the security side, whether it be cyber or physical, we want to do our jobs to empower the organization to go do better things, safer, faster, whatever, right? And so I almost think that, threat risk intelligence is where you start. And to put it in business terms, if you don't understand your market or you don't understand your competition, you are prone to be absorbed by them one way or another.
Right.
Right?
So that I'll give you the $20 later, but he really led into the next question, which is that financial piece or the business risk, right? Because remember, back in the day, business intelligence would be somebody scouring what's going on, maybe hiring private investigators, to figure out what's the organization doing, right? Now, everything that we've discussed has been defensive, right? How do we protect the organization from cyber threats or physical threats? But part of that risk intelligence should be protecting the organization from what's going on, or at least informing them of what's going on in the business space, what our competitors are doing, what the market is doing, all at the same time. And can those be connected with a physical threat that we see or a cyber threat that we see? Are they correlated? Oftentimes they might not be, but then again, they might be as well. So that, at least it seems to me, like you said, that's the start point. We're figuring out how to secure it. The next step is, okay, great. Now, what other value add are we bringing in by having a better understanding of the business and then supporting the business in that way, defensively, and then essentially understanding what's going on in the marketplace that could have a positive or an adverse impact on the organization or on our competitors, right? If then. And I think, what?
I have an answer, but I want to hear.
That was a very smug look, Scott, but go ahead.
So, I'm, among other things, I'm the Director of Investigations for an international manufacturing company, and I love, they've never had a security team, and so now we're getting to meet internal audit, we're getting to meet the mergers and acquisition team, we're going to meet HR and finance and all these other organizations. And it's a lot of fun because when they go, well, how can you help me? I get to tell them, like, well, when was the last time we acquired an organization? When was the last time you did an audit and you found an anomaly that you needed more information on? And so now the business can reach back and be like, oh, that information is actually very valuable. And as an investigator, I've got all this suite of tools that I can now go to the internet or go into open source and start trying to understand what's our competition look like, and as supply chains become more brittle, like they weren't brittle enough pre-COVID, but they become more brittle, can we apply our investigative skills to understand supply chain, to understand global politics, to understand how does the climate affect what we do, right? And so that's how I've been engaged, and I appreciate working with business partners who historically would never, don't talk to the security guys. They're scary, they'll just say no. Right. And what we should be saying is yes, and to support them in their mission. And that's really what I lead with when I am introduced or I'm talking with business leaders is, hey, I want to give you answers. I want to empower you, I want to enable you to make decisions safely and for our company and reduce, when you talk about risk, their eyes glaze over. So try not to use those risk threat type terms. Mm-hmm. But if I can empower them with information, what do you want to know? Can you find out who owns this company? Yes. How about what their net worth is? Maybe, let's see. Right? That's where I start. Right,
which becomes, or which prevents the GSOC from risk, whatever, from ingesting all the information, and then either A, not having a customer to turn it around to, right, to provide the value, or B, not know where to put it, so we just keep gathering it all and hope nobody asks us to do anything with it, right. Essentially. Right. Has anybody had a different experience or thought process from what Scott was saying?
No, I thought it was great. I mean, what you're leading up to there is just, presenting scenarios and potential consequences to action or inaction,
Yeah. I think integrating an investigative team into everything, but that's my background. would welcome that.
Right.
We'll share JTTF stories later.
Right. Yeah. So I think, well, congratulations, everybody. You guys made it to the end of the day, and we solved a problem, right? I mean,
Yeah,
we
that's right.
answered a question, we solved
You
a
guys
problem.
got
I think the next piece is, and I talked to folks about this earlier, was at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what right looks like. As we go from right's going to change tomorrow, right? So as long as we get started and work through team building, right, forming, storming, norming, and performing, and then figuring out what we need to be able to execute along that, we will find the right solution for our organization or the organization that we support. It may not be the solution that you bring to the table, may not be the one that he needs, right? But it'll be the one that your organization needs at the time, so that we can look to the future and be, like somebody said before, hiring for the future, not for now, solving the problems for the future, not for now, and becoming the intelligence center for security modernization and for the future.
Well said.
Any questions with that? I just blacked out. Okay. All right. Well, if you wouldn't mind, please give it up for the folks that were on the panel here. We appreciate your attentiveness. Thank you.